Thank you, Loretta.
Thank you very much, Gary. And thank you to Dr. Jeff Gallup too. What a wonderful example of a social scientist's life. Equal parts academia, politics and activism. Long may it continue. And can I just commend the Academy for putting on this event? I think, Jeff, you said something along these lines too, that we need to put a lot of effort into raising the profile and understanding of the value of social sciences. It is often the poor cousin to the hard sciences and the medical sciences. But the social sciences deal with people. And that's what Jeff's examples showed so clearly. People, ideas, convincing people, increasing people's awareness and understanding. And I think it was, I can quote Einstein too, I think it was Einstein who said, it's harder to crack an atom, it's easier to crack an atom than a prejudice. And the other statement that came to mind as you were talking was, science is hard, but people are harder. And it's the social scientists who are doing that hard work with the interface with people. Actually, I think that quote's often, science is easy and people are hard. But anyway. So I'm a social scientist, and my topic is social science and the future of ageing. I'm also primarily a migration scholar whose home disciplines are anthropology and sociology, close cousins of political science. I lead a team of researchers, as Gary said, at Edith Cowan University in a research entity we call the Social Ageing Futures Lab, or the SAGE Lab for short. So you might be asking yourself, why is a social scientist and a migration scholar interested in ageing? Well, I'm glad you asked. I became interested in migration around the beginning of my teenage years, largely because of the man pictured in this slide, my father. He migrated to Australia from Italy in 1956 at the age of 19. This was the peak of the massive post-war migration wave that saw many southern European migrants arrive in Australia at a time when there wasn't much ethnic diversity, and it's hard to believe it, but back then southern Europeans were considered non-white and really had a difficult trajectory being accepted. So by the time I entered my teenage years, he had worked hard enough to buy a home, something that was actually possible back then. And let's say that during my teenage years, we had some intergenerational tensions about being Australian and having Australian friends. And I thought that the audience today, who includes, at least the virtual one, high school students, I suspect that many high school students, and possibly many people in the audience, have themselves had experiences of intergenerational tensions with their parents. And this got me interested in the universal migration process from my lived experience. And studying anthropology and sociology, these two social sciences, gave me the tools to study the migration process. And my main methodology is ethnography. And what ethnography is really basically spending time, as much time as possible, with people and learning about their lives in as much detail as possible, really understanding the world from their perspective. And often this involves being with people whose voices are not always easily heard. So I'm still studying migrant communities, including the Italian community, which is where I began. And the Italy-born are now an ageing migrant community. Something like 80% of them are now over the age of 80, like my father, who's 84. So my migration studies and my ethnography of the Southern European migrant communities has slowly, over the past 10 years, taken me into the study of ageing. And I quickly discovered that ageing is one of the biggest social changes facing Australia and the world. Australia's population is ageing, as is happening in all countries across the globe. And just like last week, as Gary mentioned, the government released its 6th intergenerational report. This is a report designed to help government understand the key drivers of economic growth to help inform and improve public policy settings to better position Australia for the next 40 years. Now, the report identified 5 major forces affecting us all in the coming decades, and the first one is population ageing. Let's take a look at some of the report's projections on population ageing. The report predicts that in the next 40 years, the number of people over the age of 65 in Australia is expected to more than double, while the number over 85 will triple. They are very sobering numbers. Over the past 50 years or so, life expectancy in Australia increased by nearly 14 years for males to 81.3, and by just over 11 years for females to 85.4. And I wanted to weave my acknowledgement of country, my acknowledgement of these unceded lands, of the Whadjuk Noongar people, these beautiful lands. I wanted to weave into my acknowledgement of country the point that life expectancy for Indigenous people is still up to 10 years less than it is for non-Indigenous people. So if life expectancy increases at the same rate over the next 50 years, people will be living well into their 90s and likely beyond. The other critical statistic about ageing in Australia is that 1 in 3 people over the age of 65 were born overseas, and that's where the migrant diversity comes in. And I haven't got a graph of the migrant waves, but you see the migration waves, and each of those waves from different countries is ageing progressively. And so that diversity of ageing is going to increase into the future as well. So let me pause and ask you, how are you feeling about your life expectancy and living longer? How are you feeling about ageing? Is living longer a good thing, do you think? Are we likely to expect longer periods of time in some degree of care dependency? And what will that look like? So what are some of the biggest ageing challenges? The ageing of the population obviously brings with it a huge aged care challenge. And the recent Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Standards made the heartbreaking pronouncement, and I remember this, I'll never forget it, the first media release, the long-awaited first media release of the Royal Commission, stated that the state of aged care in this country diminishes us as a nation. The state of aged care in this country diminishes us as a nation, and this at a time when ageing population is exploding. Not surprisingly then, the second of the 5 major forces that the intergenerational report identified, affecting us all in the coming decades, is the rising demand for care and support services. And guess what? Aged care is also a migrant issue. Around 40% of our aged care workforce are migrants, and that percentage increases as the skills level decreases. Many of these migrant workers are university educated in other fields, not in aged care. Yet aged care is often the only work they can find because that's where the need is in Australia right now. Not surprisingly, migrant care workers have some of the lowest rates of job satisfaction and retention in the sector. Yet there is very little research on them. Some of this research is being done in my team. Here we have a vulnerable ageing population being cared for by a vulnerable carer population. Not a great mix. Now let's take a look at one of our biggest ageing and aged care challenges. Can you guess what it is? Dementia. Dementia today is the second leading cause of death and will soon be the leading cause of death. I know that surprises a lot of people. I fact-checked. Dementia is already the leading cause of death for women in Australia. More than 1.5 million people in Australia are involved in the care of someone living with dementia. When we consider the huge challenge of dementia, we can see that it impacts not just the individual living with the disease, but also the people needed to care for them. At this point, you might be asking yourself, but aren't these topics about ageing and dementia and caregiving, aren't these topics for medical and health sciences, nursing and allied health? And you'd be right. These are key disciplines in the service of aged care and training the care workforce. So what are a bunch of social scientists doing in this space? In the 30 years of research on dementia care, in 30 years of research on dementia medicine, there was only very recently, in the past couple of months, a breakthrough in drug therapy to treat dementia. But this breakthrough is really at the very beginning, very exciting, but at the very beginning. This drug is only effective if dementia is diagnosed early, something that is routinely not yet happening. Late diagnosis is due to stigma around the disease and lack of understanding. This is the people issue, the hard people issue, and this is where social science comes in. Medicine on its own is not enough for health and well-being. It never has been, and the medical model is very powerful and primarily treats illness as disease, not having time really to consider the whole person in a social relational context. And that's what social science brings to this really challenging issue of ageing and well-being. And in the case of dementia in particular, what is having an impact are social and cultural interventions that focus on decreasing loneliness, decreasing isolation, increasing social connectedness and belonging, things like music and arts engagement. These also go hand in hand with increasing understanding and reducing stigma, critically important to early diagnosis and getting help earlier, ensuring the medical breakthroughs will work. And this is where the social sciences, as well as the humanities and the creative humanities, have a huge role to play in supporting aged care and well-being through initiatives like our new medical research-funded project on dementia and diversity. It's got a rather odd name. It's called Befriending with Jeannie, but it's basically about social prescribing. Social prescribing. Hopefully, social prescribing is going to be a big part of our ageing futures, and social scientists are going to be needed to drive this agenda. In social prescribing futures, we would have a future where healthcare professionals, along with taking your blood pressure and giving you medicine, will start mapping your social support networks and checking how well connected you are and what level of belonging and sense of identity you have and how many supports you have in your network. And based on that, they will prescribe social engagement activities like music and arts activities to support your health and well-being, because we now know that loneliness and social isolation are as dangerous to our health as smoking and high blood pressure. Research shows that if you have fewer than 3 social supports in your network, you are at increased risk of poor health outcomes, including early death. Network supports in this research are defined really broadly. They can be a family member, a neighbour, a friend, or a pet. People routinely rate pets as more important than their GPs. Or even a friendly pharmacist, or their family. Yes, sometimes pets are rated higher than family. The social sciences have a huge role to play in guiding the building of policy landscapes to reduce stigma and increase knowledge and understanding around the social and cultural support needed to support our ageing futures. The social sciences are critical to leading the social revolution needed to change our relationship to ageing. We need a social revolution to change our relationship to ageing. And we need to start tackling ageism. The World Health Organization say that ageism is the biggest barrier to aging well. Ageism is about our relationship to aging, how we think about aging. This is why we call ourselves the Aging Futures Lab. It's an unusual combination of words to twin aging and futures. And because we tend to think about aging as not having a future, right? So one of the missions at the SAGE Lab, and it's a really quintessentially social science mission, is to change the way we think about ageing, not as something that only happens to old people, but as a process that is happening at every age. We need to start considering how what happens in pregnancy, infancy, early childhood, school years, young adulthood, etc., how what is happening to us at every age impacts our later life well-being. This is a really tough sell. This involves changing people's understandings and opinions and ideologies and thinking that's deeply embedded in normative ideologies. This is where social science comes in. Imagine getting teenagers to think about how what they are doing now might impact their later life well-being. I've tried doing this, it's really hard. It's potentially really unpopular thinking. You know, maybe the sport I'm playing puts me at high risk of concussion and later life cognitive decline. That's a really hard sell in sports mad Australia. Will my knees make it into my 80s? Really important question for us all. Most importantly, what role does government need to play in supporting this social ageing revolution? And I'll end with my reflections on the final question we were set. As I said, science is hard and people are harder, and so social science needs to be there right side by side with hard sciences. So one of the things that I think social science needs to do, and the Academy can support us, is raising the profile of social science, fighting this ridiculous distinction between the hard sciences and the rest, and promoting the hard sciences above the rest as if they're somehow more important. These disciplines really need to be interconnected and interrelated and working together. As I said, medicine is not enough on its own. It needs an understanding about individual capacity and community capacity to do the things science tells us we need to do to age well. It needs to recognise that that is entirely dependent on social support networks, on social, relational, cultural understandings of the person within that network, and that's the role of social scientists. Access and equity issues. Migrants routinely access services later and in poorer states of health. Why? Partly because there aren't any services appropriate to their needs, and partly because they lack understanding about what services are out there. So these are cultural and language issues which continue to be significant barriers to access and equity for diverse communities. Social scientists know from working with communities, spending lots of time with people, the way to break this cycle and increase access and equity through things like promoting community champions, targeting cultural barriers and language barriers with resources, and so on. I think I've probably run out of time, so I'm going to stop there and just conclude by thanking the Academy for this, privilege to speak today in this really important forum. Thank you very much.